the shogunate is in trouble. That is kind of the bottom line. We can talk about you've already seen in class. But I want to think about again about the idea here of religion. So people are not sure what's going to happen in Japan. The foreign arrivals, the economic issues, I'll discuss those in a second, and also just in general, a lot of anxiety and confusion are sort of given even more concrete visibility through nature. And one of the things that happens is in the 1850s and 60s, there are lots of natural disasters. And as you can imagine, right, in a country in which the fate in which sort of the workings of nature are often easily read at a local level to have importance, right, for politics, family decisions, all these kinds of things. This is a big deal. I've shown you, I think, a couple of times a slide about an earthquake. This is the great Ansei earthquake, and I want to see if we can do some sort of like, as historians, right, if we can think about the date and why this matters. So the earthquake that happened in 1854, there was actually two earthquakes. The bigger one was it covered like all of Japan's eastern seaboard, and there were over 10,000 deaths, all the way from sort of like Nagoya up to what today is like the Kamakura area. So that was a big deal. And there was another earthquake, a bit smaller, that was mostly focused around the Edo or the Kanto plain. And in this area, there are about 6,000 deaths in 1855. But also, importantly, Edo largely was destroyed by fire. So these things are just a few examples. There are other things that happen. We talked about famine. We talked about some crop failures. There are lots of things happening. There's some tidal waves, but these are just some really big ones that I want to emphasize today. So thinking about what I said about bad omens, right? Why are these dates important? Thinking about, I mean, if you, let's say that you're somebody in Japan and you're looking at what's happening and you're reading increasingly available broadsides and like gazetteers that give current information. You read about the arrival of Commodore Perry, and then this happens, and then this happens, right? So why are these dates important?
I was going to say because shortly after Commodore Perry.
Okay, so Commodore Perry, that's a really big one, right? So even if you don't know about Commodore Perry, which this is happening in a sort of in the bay of Edo, right? But you may have heard about assassinations that are going to be happening afterwards, or you may have heard about the repeated sort of like stepping down of shogunal high counselors, right? So things are a bit chaotic, and this, I think, sort of like comes and hammers home the importance, the reality that things are not great, and perhaps that the Japans are not happy with how things are going. Maybe even Japan has crossed a bad threshold by opening up to the West. So these things are all going to be things that we're going to see having increasing importance. So this is one of the things that the shogunate has going against it without even doing anything, these kinds of bad portents. We also talked a bit about commoners, and I want to go back to that today and what they're experiencing and why they're looking to these new religions, for example. One of the things that I mentioned I wanted to go back to is the gold crisis. This is a really big deal. And basically what happened was that the gold, like the price of gold in Japan was cheaper than in the rest of the sort of global market, like the Western, American and European markets. So when Japan opened for trade, Europeans and Americans quickly bought up all they could of Japanese gold. So in order to combat that, because Japan needed to have gold reserves, to have those be available, they then quickly tried to fight that by lowering the price of gold, which I think makes sense. But this led to, in fact, a pretty serious problem of deflation. So that was what happened there. People's money was worth less. But on top of that, we also talked about prices going up, which goes along with the deflation of the currency, and things like silk and rice were really expensive, like 10 times their price, and it went up every few weeks. So people were unhappy, and they were writing about that. And again, they were looking to maybe heaven can help us, because the government clearly is not able to fix these problems, right? And then we also talked about American imports, followed by German and French and Russian imports that are going to be brought into Japan with low tariffs, making it hard if you have your own mom and pop shop to sell your goods at a competitive price. So these things are all going to make the most Japanese who are not part of the samurai class or the court nobility pretty, it's going to make them unhappy and worried about the future. So we talked about commons, we talked about the cosmos a bit and nature. They're all involved here. And if we then move on to the samurai class, the ones that are running the show, they also are, this class also is just going through a really dramatic change at this time in history as well. Do you recall I mentioned this group here, the men of high purpose, a few times? So like, who are these men of high purpose? Like, how would we describe these shishi? And what's important to our story today?
They're like well-educated.
All right, so no one says that they're well-educated. So yeah, they are well-educated. Lowest of the low, right? They aren't daimyo, they don't have the top level, but they have education, right? And they're dissatisfied. And they want to sort of, they feel called, right, to apply their great knowledge to fixing Japan. So very, I think, very well put. They also come from a certain small group of domains. They don't come from those who live mostly in Edo, who come from their own home domains to live in Edo. They don't come from the domains that fought on the right side of the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 of Tokugawa Ieyasu. They come from these outside domains. Mostly we're talking about Choshu and Tosa. And they also come from Mito. If you recall, Mito, this is actually interesting. So Mito is one of the three branches of the Tokugawa family, so the major branches. And two branches, if need be, can provide a shogun. But Mito, the third branch, cannot. So it's like this sort of unappreciated, unloved brother, right? They're able to have land and property and, to be pretty well up, but they're not able to be part of government or to become shoguns. So there is this issue, right? And that's part of what's behind this frustration that they have with the current system. And how surprising that they then support an ideology that opposes the shogunate staying in power. So anyway, those are the sort of main zones where we see this ideology and these men of high purpose becoming more active. Over time, we will add more men from Satsuma, and also from other places like Hizen, which is up here. So they're very, and here we can see the focal point being Choshu. Choshu really is sort of the problem child of the shogunate. They're the ones that have the most men of high purpose, or shishi, the ones that have the most frustration with the current system and who are also the most active in trying to push for change. So we have Choshu activists, and we have the Mito ideology really coming into direct contact. So they're ideologies of dissent. And I've mentioned these a few times, but we talked about this idea of nativist studies or national studies promoted by Motoori Norinaga. Does that ring a bell? This idea that Japan is Japanese, that needs to get rid of all the Chinese influence, that the emperor should be in charge of Japan and should be the person to lead the country, not the shogun. And this has developed into an actionable ideology. We've also discussed a little bit the ideas of like Choshu's Yokoi Shonan, this teacher, right, who's trying to promote the idea of like expel the barbarian and revere the emperor, being taught at this school in this domain to these sort of ambitious young, relatively underemployed samurai. So these are all things that are going to that are just pushing. They're just pushing to sort of boil over into something more concrete like rebellion or even revolution. Also talked about violence and murder. Talked about the assassination of officials who are involved in opening Japan to the West, like for example, the High Minister or Chief Counselor, I should say, Ii Naosuke. Talked about the killing of the British merchant, right, who wouldn't get off. He wouldn't show the proper reverence to the passing samurai of in the retinue of the daimyo of Satsuma. So we see these things happening. We also talked about how sometimes these things boil over into actual war, right? The Choshu fighting against several countries, Western countries, or Satsuma fighting against the British. These encounters, right, are not part of a pacified, unified country. They're part of a country that's, again, marching slowly but surely towards war. Choshu, though, continues to become like a hotbed for dissent. And loyalists who are fed up with how the shogunate runs things, they are now coming from all over Japan to Choshu to try and share their thoughts with other people, other shishi like them, and to see if they can perhaps move the needle towards action. They're even sometimes going and finding ways to have imperial audiences, which is happening in Kyoto, to just see if they can convince him to make some good choices that would put him more in charge of Japan, and perhaps along the way bring them up from their sort of middle class to higher class status, right, having more power. So we see that happening. For example, we talked about the Emperor Kome, who commands the shogunate to expel all the foreign ships in 1863. This is an idea that was clearly sort of nurtured and given to him by these kinds of imperial loyalists who know that this is going to lead to a confrontation. And where they're most coming from Choshu. A critical point in this story that I didn't talk about last time, but I think is going to help us to see the road to war is, we can talk about it as the so-called Choshu insurrection. Choshu, loyalists who come either from or to Choshu, but who go from Choshu to take action, they actually march on the capital, on the imperial capital, which is Kyoto, and they want to, and so they march directly from here, where they're taken care of and not being prosecuted, all the way to Kyoto, and their goal is to, in fact, kidnap the emperor, and to then liberate him and make him the true ruler of Japan. So this effort is really all about trying to sort of get the emperor out from underneath the shogun, who has actually like an official who then looks after the emperor. That's true. And the emperor has a palace, but is not actually ruling, as you have seen again and again. So it's trying to give him actual power. So they march on Kyoto. So Japan, we've been in Japan, a very sort of a Pacific, calm Japan. There's been some riots, and there's been a few minor issues. There's been some ups and downs, but we haven't had an actual rebellion in Japan since the Christian-led groups of Shimabara, right, refused to give in and drop Christianity in 1639. So basically, like 2 centuries of not fighting, and then we have this battalion that marches on the capital, on the imperial capital, which is. So this is a major event. The shogunate sends its two most. It sends soldiers from its 2 most sort of martial domains, Satsuma and Aizu, the best fighters, to go and stop this from happening, and they succeed. And then they actually even prosecute and execute the Choshu leaders who are in charge of this effort. But like stopping one of these events cannot stop this very clear like momentum towards revolution. This image is one that obviously is staged, but it is one that from the 1860s shows some plotting, right? Some thinking about how to impact and influence the future of Japan. The shogunate was not standing by just sitting on its hands. It was really thinking about how to rule better, how to improve things. I mentioned this a few of these things last time. They realized that the daimyo class is spending so much money and having a hard time, in fact, ruling over their domains. They decided to allow them to stay more often and longer in their home domains. So they reduced the sankin kotai, or the alternate attendants, to every 2 years, and then every 3 years. So they're stepping it down. They also allow family members who would like to go and live in the home domain. So this, if you recall, the system was made to keep all the daimyo in check by keeping their wives, plural, and then their children in Edo. But here we see the shogunate saying, well, you know what, we're going to let you go back to your domains and stay there and come visit if you need to. But this is a big step towards trying to give, sort of to conciliate things, to make things a little bit less contentious. They also work really hard for about 10 years to cut expenses, because there is a pretty serious ballooning debt that the shogunate is carrying. They also they also listen to all the advice from their opponents about trying to westernize to then oppose the West. So the shogunate opened Japan to the West through the efforts of Inosuke, but they've been sort of reticent to actually adopt Western-style technologies and fighting strategies, all these kinds of things. And Choshu is one of the main advocates for this. So the Choshu and Satsuma voices prevail. The shogunate does then bring in French experts to come and train their military, to sell them better equipment, all these kinds of things. So there really is, again, like a real effort to change things. And perhaps the biggest change is the shogunate tries to reconceptualize the place of the shogunate vis-a-vis the emperor. So the shogunate is obviously supposed to be carrying out the imperial will, right? It's being handed down from the emperor, and on their behalf the shogun is ruling, but we all know that the shogun has all the real power. What they would like to do is to create an official unity between the shogunate and the court. And there's several plans how to do this, but to sort of make it so that the emperor can rule directly and then have the shogun as his counselor or a member of his cabinet, right? So this is a new proposal. And also, I should mention, the emperor and the emperor's wives, they're all, for the most part, blood relatives to the shogun or the shogunal family. There are lots of blood ties between these two. So it's not like we're talking about very distinct bodies coming into contact. So it would make sense, in fact, to have these cousins and cousins removed, right, be ruling together, or so argue the shogunate. And perhaps the most important the last step that the shogunate takes as an institution is they bring in a shogun who they think has the right mentality to oversee this transition towards a more collaborative government. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, he actually is that supposed to be there? He is extremely reform-minded. And in fact, back in the 1850s, before the Ansei Purge, if you'll recall, of Inosuke, who either executed or fired all the officials who would oppose Japan's opening to the West, those officials who opposed opening to the West were open to some kind of changes and to reform the shogunate. They wanted him to become the next shogun. So he's been around for a while as someone who is a forward-thinking, progressive, active, open-minded leader who could perhaps be important for Japan. He was actually from the Mito branch. Remember, there's 3 branches to the shogunate's family, right? So he could not become shogun. But because he had all this promise, even as like a teenager, he was adopted into another of the 3 branches, one of which, the key branch, which is eligible to become, to provide a shogun if one is not, if it's not produced by the main line. And so, at the death of the previous shogun, Ienari, I think it was, he is chosen as the reform-minded, progressive leader to help take the shogunate into this new era. It's a new era. It's brand. There's foreign ships, right? There is extreme sort of island connectivity in Japan. There's this humongous economic crisis. All these things are very, very new for Japan. And I should mention, before he gets this role, he's also the commander of the Imperial Palace Defense Forces that repel the Choshu attack / rescue attempt in Kyoto. So he was a good choice. Even though he is, in fact, the protector of the shogun, of the emperor, and he sees his role as trying to basically like quietly find a better role for the shogunate that will allow the emperor to be in charge. Even though he has these goals, and he's made them clear, and he's now being supported by those from his home domain, Mito, but also throughout the shogunate, what's going to happen is not clear. There is also a new emperor, Emperor Meiji, who is very impressionable and would like to see a more important role for himself and his family in government. But we also see that these 2 figures, they have blood ties. They have conversations. They're not enemies. So the enemy element really comes from forces like from behind the emperor, who are really trying to push for the shogun to be abolished. So we have these 2 factions, right, that are competing, but there's not an outright rebellion until 1868. So it takes a couple years before this becomes an actual rebellion. Here we can see Saigo Takamori from Satsuma, who is a key member of this moment, of this time. So the Boshin War is the war fought by imperial loyalists, those who want to put the emperor in charge. When they, and it starts with a very small spark. So in January, imperial loyalists who've actually been training a small military in their domains, they march on the capital in Edo. They realize that Edo, where the real power of Japan resides, is where they have to make their impact to make this, to turn things around. So these soldiers who have been training with British and American help attack, well, they seize the capital city of Edo. They seize the shogunal palace and proclaim the restoration. And they also proclaim that the shogun is going to be, it's abolished, and that the shogun's rule and all the regions of the shogun, all these rules are going to be abolished. Japan will be led by the emperor directly. Importantly, the current shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, is stripped of all his titles and land. Even though, as I just said, he was trying to find a way forward that was going to be conciliatory, that was going to be collaborative, and that was not going to make things so complicated. So he and a retinue come down from Edo to Kyoto, where the imperial palace is located. And their goal is to protest and say, Emperor, we would be happy to find a way that's not going to involve war, that's not going to involve completely disenfranchising those who are shoguns or who are part of the shogunate. Can we discuss this? And by the way, I'm a big fan, right? but it's not, the emperor is not the one who intervenes. It is the imperial military forces who have come from Choshu, in particular, who blocked the entry into the imperial space of the shogunate. And this is where the war between the imperial forces and the imperial loyalist forces and the shogunate forces breaks out. This battle of Toba Fushimi is the spark that ignites it is the ignition, I suppose, of the Boshin War. Boshi is the year in which this war takes place, which is 1868. I'm not going to go through all of this, but the Boshin Senzo, the Boshin War, is a war that brings Choshu and Tosa, so two groups that are very much against the shogunate, to the capital to lead a war to then try and transform Japan through force. But they have a new ally in Satsuma. Satsuma, as we've seen a little while ago, they were very actively involved in helping the shogunate to avoid Choshu's imperial imperial kidnap attempt, right? They are one of the sort of most important, best fighting domains, if you will, right, in Japan for the shogunate. So they are not right away convinced that this is the right thing to do, even though Satsuma is a Tozama outside daimyo. They have been forced, they've been sort of kept out of government and far away from the centers of power for over 2 centuries. But they're not on board right away. But it is through negotiation and convincing that they are then brought to that the Shishi, I should say, of Satsuma, they are convinced that this is how things should go. So they join up with Tosa and with Choshu in particular, and they march. And the campaigns go up through Edo and then come back down to finalize things. What you're going to read about over the weekend is the last push, or I guess the most important push from Edo to Aizu. Aizu is the other of these like really hard fighting, with martial valor, militant domains that the shogun calls upon over historically when they need like police or military intervention. So Aizu and Satsuma are both important, for example, in putting down the Christian uprising that happens in Shimabara. So we have kind of like the right and left hand of the shogunate. They're going to actually come into contact, and you guys will read about that over the weekend. So I'm actually going to skip over this part, because I think we can actually go back on Monday and talk about what the war looks like, because you'll have read about someone who's living through it. We're going to start talking about Japan as it sort of reemerges as a modern country overnight. It really was overnight. The Shishi, who then become military leaders, who then announce this new government, they are pretty smart. As you said, Nolan, they're well educated. They've seen a lot of Europeans face to face in the ports of Choshu or the ports of Satsuma, or also eventually also in Yokohama. So they have a lot of knowledge and experience, and they're more comfortable with this new landscape. One of the things that they realized early on is that they need to they have to choose an imperial capital. And there's some debate. Kyoto is the current imperial capital, but all the power and all the money is in Edo, right? So what do? Do we want to make everything come down to Kyoto or not? And the choice is made to make Edo the capital of Japan, but to make it into an imperial capital. And there's a whole book about this, so it's really a big, it's a big topic. But anyway, they choose Edo because it is a place that already has infrastructure to be a national capital, hopefully even an imperial capital. They changed the name from Edo to Tokyo, which just means Eastern Capital. And they also then make a big ceremony of the emperor sort of progressing from the old capital to the new capital. And again, they're really very intentional about this process. It's in the newspapers. There are paintings that are done. There are program stops along the Tokaido, so people can actually look and see the emperor making this trip. We'll discuss this more in a couple of classes, but the emperor at this point is not someone that no one knows who the emperor is. Everyone knows the shogun is in charge of Japan. The emperor is like a sort of a fairy tale, perhaps, right? There's not a lot of knowledge of what the emperor is or what he does or his power. So now this is part of a campaign that we'll discuss later to make the emperor and help everyone in Japan know that he is in charge of Japan now again. Another part of this process is the proclamation in the same months in the fall of a charter oath. And the emperor again is right again front and center. The charter oath is it's more or less a promise of how the new imperial government is going to govern. And the ceremony in which it takes place has the emperor sitting on the side, and then it has not called this yet, but it'll become later on like a prime minister figure who reads this charter oath to the imperial ancestors. And again, this image here also drawn lots of times, put in papers. People across the country were told about this, and there were even special prayers that were said, right? Shinto prayers that were said that also were written down in papers as well, and that were sent throughout the country, so that everyone knew that at like this time, I think it was in the morning at 10 a.m. At 10 a.m., you should look to the east, if you're in the south, or if you're in the north, to the west, towards the new capital of Tokyo, to see the emperor, or at least to visualize the emperor saying these important prayers for Japan as a country, announcing the future of Japan to the imperial ancestors, who at this point were more and more understanding are the most important sort of bloodline links between the people of Japan today, or at that time then, and the beginnings of Japan historically. This charter oath has 5 key oaths, and here they are.